Welcome everybody to Palo Alto College's Virtual Heritage Month 2020 with guest speaker, Dr. Ernesto Mireles. I'm Dr. Lloyd Rodriguez and I'm the coordinator for the Center for Mexican American Studies at Palo Alto College. The Palo Alto College Annual Heritage Month celebration is a collaboration between Palo Alto College's Center for Mexican American Studies and the Office of Student Life and features a series of engaging and educational events that are free and open to the public. The full calendar of events can be found on the Palo Alto College Heritage Month website. As with previous Heritage Month talks, toward the end of our discussion today, we will have an open Q&A using the Q&A feature available to all attendees. Additionally, students, please be sure to complete the survey located in the chat feature to receive credit for your attendance. We will be allotting time at the end of the talk to complete the survey. All attendees will be entered to a drawing for pack swag and giveaways, including a copy of Dr. Mireles' book, which was graciously donated by Dr. Mireles. Winners will be announced on the PAC Student Life Instagram platform toward the end of the Heritage Month series. And so today we continue our Heritage Month, month-long celebration with an engaging discussion with Dr. Ernesto Todd Mireles, author of Insurgent Aztlán, The Liberating Power of Cultural Resistance. Ernesto Todd Mireles has worked as a student, community, union, and electoral organizer. As coordinator of the Frantz Fanon Community Strategy Center at Prescott College, he organized for the United Farm Workers, United Steelworkers, and American Federation of Teachers. Mireles is the co-director of the Social Justice Community Organizing Master's Program, where he teaches community organizing. He holds a Master of Social Work in Organizational and Community Practice and a PhD in American Studies from Michigan State University. Mireles is working on releasing a second book of shorter writings entitled Chicano, Journal of Revolutionary Thought. Mireles is completing a documentary titled War of the Flea, Fight for Chicano Studies. And now a little bit about the book we'll be discussing today. Insurgent Aztlán examines literature produced by the Chicano movement in the United States from 1848 to the present to analyze how specific Chicano literary tropes originating in pre-conquest Mesoamerican culture have persisted throughout the centuries, solidifying into present-day themes of political cultural resistance for the modern Chicano. Insurgent Aztlán shows how national liberation theory and anti-colonial history created specifically through literature by the colonized is oppositional to colonial history in the United States. Within this oppositional context, insurgency theories of Third World liberationists, as well as the role of literature in national liberation struggles, are analyzed and applied in an examination of the Chicano movement in the United States and the literature it produces. It is also the 2020 International Latino Book Award winner. So Dr. Mireles, welcome to Palo Alto College and congratulations on your award.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm really excited to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. We are too. So if you can let us know, Dr. Mireles, most of us have not read your book yet, but hopefully we will soon.
Hopefully.
Can you give us, hopefully. Can you give us a brief overview of what your book is about and what motivated you to write it?
Yeah. Well, the description that you just read is it's really good. Every time I hear that, I'm like, wow, that sounds like a really good book. So what we're really looking at is Chicanx literature, right? And the thing that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to decide in this book, what kind of literature is it? I mean, and so when we think about the Chicano movement, right, we think about it, in a lot of different ways. But one of the ways that it's been posited right from the very beginning, and I mean, even like from 1848, and I'm not saying there was a Chicano movement in 1848, but there was a thing that was happening there. And it's really about liberation, right? It's about throwing off the sort of colonial status that was imposed on us by the United States after the Mexican-American War. And it's a response to the oppression, right, that we've been facing. So part of what has happened, though, and this takes us forward, my personal interest has always been very much in organizing, community organizing, union organizing. And that's the work that I've done for the majority of my life outside of the academy. Around 2000, well, it wasn't around, it was right after 9/11 happened. I was watching the news, like many of us were, very intently. And I began to notice that newscasters were they were being very deliberate about who they called terrorists and who they called insurgents. And that sort of struck me because having a degree in journalism, a bachelor's degree in journalism myself, I could tell and I knew that when I was hearing those distinctions, that those things meant two very different things. Unlike the way that most people thought about those two terms, they kind of made them synonymous with each other. And so I looked up what an insurgent was because I felt like I was pretty sure what the definition of a terrorist was. And so I looked up what an insurgent was, and I realized that, from the definition, an insurgent is a person who is fighting against an occupying power. And as I was beginning my graduate work, I started to really think about that. And I started to think about whether or not the Chicano movement was an insurgent movement. And that led me down sort of a rabbit hole. It was a good rabbit hole of looking at what's called resistance literature. And I was particularly caught up with two books that were by a professor who I think was at UT Austin, named Barbara Harlow. She wrote specifically about resistance literature. And that's what really set me down this path of writing this book, because what I was really trying to figure out was if the literature that we were producing through the Chicano movement, Chicanx literature, is resistance literature. And if it is resistance literature, then that that has certain implications for the future, the same way that it's had implications around the world in different national liberation movements.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah.
So your book talks about the history of indigenous and Chicanx resistance to white settler colonialism. Can you explain the concept of white settler colonialism to us?
Yeah, I think so. There's different kinds of colonialism. I mean, there's the sort of colonialism where somebody goes and they just they extract resources from the country. They use the resources to make the mother country rich. That's kind of the way that a lot of people really think about colonialism. Settler colonialism is a little bit different in that people from the mother country come and they stay in the colony, and as a result of that, they begin to see the land that they've occupied as as kind of a homeland or a motherland for them. So part of what happens, and I think that this part is actually really interesting too, because a large part of what had to happen in terms of looking at or making a determination about whether or not, Chicano literature is resistance literature was really looking at national liberation movements from around the globe. And so, read a lot of Mao, read a lot of Fanon, Ho Chi Minh, Cabral, and really looking at like the intersection, right, of culture and politics and resistance. So Cabral has this really interesting idea that is a huge part of this book when he talks about the return to history. So what he's positing, and there's two particular pieces. There's a speech that he gave in 1966 at the Tricontinental Conference in Cuba, Havana. And the name of this speech is called the Weapon of Theory. And what Cabral is saying is that for those of us who are colonized or come from colonized people, that we have, there was a moment before colonization that, there was sovereignty and there was national identity. And that at this moment of colonization, this moment of conquest, that history was interrupted. And that the period that we live in now is this period of colonialism, of settler colonialism, because the history that we live in now is not our history. It is the history of the settler. What we're trying to do, or what our purpose is to find a way to return to history And Cabral and Fanon and Mao and all of them, they call it that a national liberation movement. And so thinking about when we talk about decolonization, when we talk about when we talk about decolonization, right? I mean, what we're really talking about is national liberation. And so thinking about like what that means to actually return to history. So when people use the term Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, when we talk about our indigenous past, our indigenous roots, I mean, what we're really attempting to do is find a way to reassert this this history, right? To return to history. But what Cabral and Fanon and all of them make very clear is that we can only return to history as a national grouping. We can't we can't necessarily do that individually, right? That's something that has to be done as a group. And so settler colonialism is the exact opposite of that. It is the structure, is the hegemonic structure that has settled over this land that tells us that our history is George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It is the structure that tells us that that we are lesser than, right? That we are the other, even though this is land that was controlled by different parts or different portions of our ancestors, right? Obviously, different people in different parts of the hemispheres, but still. So, yeah, you have settler colonialism, which is the history, right, of settlers from Europe here in the Americas, and then you have the National Liberation Movement that opposes it, and these two things are diametrical to each other. Guillermo Bonfil Batalla, in his book Profundo Mexico, says that there's a permanent confrontation between Western civilization and Mesoamerican civilization, and that confrontation will exist until one of them prevails. So when I think about white settler colonialism, that's what I think about.
Wow, that's really profound. That's very, very interesting. You make a note in your book that you use X in the spelling of Chicano or Chicanx because the X is symbolic of indigeneity. Can you explain the term indigeneity and more specifically this term within the context of Mexican American or Chicano Chicanx identity?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. This is a good question. I read this one yesterday. I was like, oh, that's a good question. So I think that one of the things that it's important to remember is that many people, many of us who are descendants like Mexicanos, right? That we've been detribalized. And it doesn't mean that we can't figure out certain things or that we can't know, but it's different, I think, for us than it has been for a lot of, for the people, our indigenous cousins who were here in what we call the United States. So we think about it, though. I mean, just because we don't know exactly, who or what tribe or nation that we come from, it doesn't mean that we're not descendants of indigenous people, right? I mean, if you think about Mexican Spanish and the amount of native words that are in there, the food that we eat, the way that we think about the world, if you think about, our customs, I mean, and there'll probably be some people who maybe get mad at this, but even you look at like symbols like the Virgin of Guadalupe, right? Who appears to Juan Diego on the hill of Tepeyac, which is where the temple for the goddess whose name totally escaped. Thank you. I just drew like a huge blank right at that second. I mean, there's no way to say, you cannot say that these things are not connected to each other, right? I mean, that is yeah. I mean, they're all connected. I mean, we are who we are. So thinking about this, like in terms of indigeneity, right? I mean, one of the, we've all heard the slogan, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." But okay, And we all, we've all said it, we've all been at marches, we've all been at rallies, but that's true, right? It's not like a catchy little phrase. It's not a thing that we're saying to make ourselves feel better. That is actually true. We have always been here, as our ancestors have always been here, right? We are indigenous to this continent. And so that's a claim that we have to make as a community. That's a thing that we have to accept, is that we are a part of the lifeblood of this continent. Just within the last week, an article came out that was written by Ian Haney Lopez and another person whose name escapes me, but they did a survey, and it wasn't a huge survey, but in this survey, 3 out of 4 people who identified as Latino said they were white, which I thought was really interesting. That means that there's only like 25% of us who don't think that we're white. So, I mean, what does that mean, right? As we're looking at this, and the more that we sort of accept that rhetoric, the more that we think about ourselves in terms of somebody who actually, came here. Like, I mean, like, how do you come to the United States if your ancestors have been here for innumerable centuries? You can't come here. This geopolitical border that's been drawn is irrelevant to the history, to the existence of this continent, and to the existence in the movement, in the mass migrations of the people who have or who are the descendants of people who have always been here, right? So when we take on that claim of indigeneity, I mean, really what we're doing is we're saying we belong here. We are not other, right? We are not, I mean, we're not other. We are a dispossessed nations, finding, struggling, resisting to come back to history, right? To return to this place that is rightfully ours. The same way that it is for everybody around the world, the same way that it is for Palestinians, the same way that it is for Chechens, right? The same way that it is for the Kurds. I mean, these struggles have international dimensions, and the Chicano struggle is no different, right? So when we claim indigeneity, that is what we're doing. We're placing ourselves within these international struggles within an international framework.
I think you did a really good job of answering that.
Thank you. All right.
You said, let me give it a shot. I'm like, that was really good. And so that goes back to, so I know students oftentimes, just as a follow-up question, students oftentimes ask, well, what is the difference between Mexican American and Chicano, right? So that would be a good explanation of why you would claim Chicano, is claiming that indigeneity, right? Claiming that belonging, right?
I think so. I think that I think the other thing that's important to remember is this. Words matter, but their definitions change, and they're constantly in flux, right? And actually, the fact that it's constantly changing, I believe, verifies and speaks to the dynamic nature of what it means to be Chicano in the United States right now, right? Because if it wasn't changing, if it wasn't in flux, if there wasn't a debate, right, then the conclusion of my book would be, I think, very different. And it would, the conclusion then would be that there is not a resistance movement among Chicanos in the United States. Because the only way that can really happen is if we are in doubt, right? I mean, definition, I would argue, is death, right? As soon as we can define something, as soon as we say, this is what this thing is, that's over. It's done. It's like Latin, right? It never changes. It's always the same, but that's not who we are. We are in flux. We are constantly changing, constantly evolving, constantly debating. And I think that is also very much a condition of this idea of indigeneity that we were talking about.
Thank you for that. So next question I have is, your book discusses indigenous resistance spanning from the last Mexica or Azteca or Aztec Emperor Cuauhtemoc to contemporary cultural productions such as Robert Rodriguez's film Machete, which is very fascinating. While social contexts have changed, obviously, there's a lot that's changed over those years. Are there any constants that you see as far as a politics of resistance throughout time with regard to indigenous and Chicanx resistance?
Yeah, I think that from the very beginning, if you look at these ideas, like the idea of Aztlán, or these are all ideas that I talk about, concepts that I talk about directly in the book. Aztlán, the Virgin of Guadalupe, the mandato. At their core, what they're doing is they're either saying these guys got to go, or they're saying they're gonna go. Right? I mean, the whole idea of Aztlán is centers around sovereignty, right? It centers around a reemergence into history. I mean, that's literally what the idea of Aztlán is. With the mandato, that part was actually really interesting because I had grown up reading that, and as a kid, and I was very inspired by it. But it's a speech that was actually probably wasn't written until the 1950s, and it was put out by a Mexicanist group in Mexico in the 1950s. And so but I think is also very interesting, and I don't think that it what's the word I'm looking for? I don't think it diminishes the power of it at all. I think that it is very much still a carry through. I was talking, actually, one of the guys that I write about in the book, Curly Talapayawa from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I spoke to him for a long time about this particular piece because he's, I think, very much an expert like on these writings. And he said that he believed that this speech was taken from one of the codexes, and he showed me the part that he was talking about, and it's very similar, talking about the children and teaching them and all of this, but it's much more poetic language in some ways, as Nawa is. And so I think that that's sort of the constant. I mean, even if you come right down to like Machete, right? I mean, it's a fascinating movie. It really is. And it came out right as I was writing this book, like as I was really engaged in the writing of it. But I think that there's a couple of things about Machete that cannot be overlooked, and one of them is that this is really one of the first movies where you have Mexicans or Chicanos who are not fighting each other, right? They're fighting white people, and they're fighting them in a way. They're fighting them for political reasons, right? They're not fighting them for personal reasons. This isn't about vengeance. It's not about honor. It's about politics. It's about who belongs. So you have this whole network of people who are sneaking individuals, into the United States, and how do you protect that? And then the whole idea that this group of people would stockpile arms, right? That they would have this network. I mean, the whole thing is fascinating, and I think really represents a leap forward, but is also taking these same ideas, right? We're not foreigners. We are not the other. I mean, even in the end, when Robert De Niro was killed, and they're using the same lines about welcome to America. I mean, this there's a lot that's happening there. But this, I think that it goes back to this idea, like when we were talking about indigenous resistance, right? I mean, from the very beginning, it is, we will rise, we will continue to learn and to teach. I mean, let's go, and I think this part's also very interesting too. I mean, if you go back to even like the Virgin of Guadalupe, I mean, all of this happens 12 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, right? There is no way that anybody can say with any sort of absolute certainty that the Spanish, 12 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, had Mexico what we call Mexico under control, right? So, to think of it as anything other than like this uh, movement of resistance is, it just isn't going to work. And so when we think about when Aztlán emerges, right, in 1969 at the Chicano Youth Conference, people knew about it before then, but they hadn't really talked about it. But the way that it's been reimagined since then, the way that it's been written about, the countless books and dissertations and articles that have come out about this idea of Aztlán show that there is some seriousness about this idea, that it's not just a thing, And so one of the debates that we had during my PhD program when we were talking about Aztlán was there were some people there who were all like, "Oh, nobody ever talks about that anymore," right? But they do talk about it. They call it the Reconquista. They call it immigration invasion. Samuel Huntington's 2004 article, The Hispanic Challenge, and the book that he wrote subsequently after that, Who We Are. This is what he's talking about. He and Lou Dobbs and all the rest of them. I know Lou Dobbs ain't on TV anymore, but he spent a lot of time talking about the Reconquista. They're talking about this, the re-indigenation, right? The re-Indianization of the Americas. That is their worry. That's what this wall is about, right? They're trying to stop something that they see will fundamentally alter white Anglo-Saxon Protestant society here in the United States. And that is what they're trying to stop. So, when we think about resistance, there's all these things that are happening, right? And, like there's a slogan that says that my existence is resistance. I'm not really so sure about that, especially if 3 out of 4 people think that they're, Latinos in the United States think that they're white. I'm not sure that our existence is resistance. Resistance is intentional. It is directed. It has a political element to it, not just a cultural element to it, right? It has a political element to it. And I think that all of these things, this is the sort of glue that holds all of these ideas together, is the political element.
Thank you. So you mentioned the term Aztlán several times. For those in the audience who aren't familiar with the term, can you give a brief definition of what this concept of Aztlán is within Chicano Mexican American politics or political identity?
Yeah, just real quickly. Aztlán is the place where the Mexica, the Aztec, immigrated from to central Mexico. There, where Mexico Tenochtitlan was built. Nobody really knows where it's at. There are some people, notably Roberto Rodriguez and Apache Maiz, who spent and wrote books. They spent quite a bit of time researching this and wrote books about it. Sort of like pinpointing the maybe the location of it. I think that I agree with both of them and their findings. It's not like a disagree or not agree. I think that what Maiz has to say about it is a little bit more to my personal liking. And he's saying that Aztlán is, it doesn't actually matter where Aztlán was. What matters is, are we ready to begin building it? So, at one time, a location in the 1960s during the Chicano Power movement, Aztlán really became people really started to think of the entire Southwest as Aztlán. And so that's why they talk about that. The states, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, as being Aztlán. And really, when you look at it, you can see that that's where the population center, or the population is weighted for Chicanos, in this part of the country. Although that's changed a lot in the last 30 years. So yeah, Aztlán is homeland. It's an idea of a place, like a nation, like a land base for Chicanos.
Thank you. My next question is, In your book, you discuss the Tucson Unified School District and how its Mexican American Studies program was shut down through the passing of House Bill 2281, making it essentially illegal to teach Mexican American studies there. It was later reversed, right, as being discriminatory and unconstitutional. What do you believe is the importance of Mexican American studies or ethnic studies in general within the context of your book?
I mean, there's a couple of things. One, I mean, the Tucson program, the MAS program. I mean, if you look at the statistics for that program, one of the things that becomes immediately clear is that it was the most successful education program for Mexican Americans in the history of this country, hands down, right? I believe that they achieved that success through well, through some excellent teaching. And I think that I know that the people who were involved in that were that like they were in it, right, to win it. Like this was very important to them. But I think that ultimately what happens, and I think that what makes it important is what they were doing or what they did was they sort of pierced the veil of hegemony, right? And they started to really help their students see, what was really happening in terms of like their own, economic situations, their own cultural situation, and as a result of that, they were able to really challenge some of these prevailing ideas. And I think that this is the part that prevailing ideas about who we are as Mexicans, right? Like the dominant society's ideas. And I think that this was this was a big part of it. Think about it. Most of us don't ever have a Chicano or even an ethnic studies class until we're in college, right? Some of us don't even really get this material until we're in graduate school. What changes when you create a educational system that centers Mexican American identity, politics, culture, right? From the time a student is in kindergarten until they graduate from high school. I mean, public education in the United States is a propaganda machine that turns us into American citizens, right? We stand and we say the Pledge of Allegiance, and we learn the national anthem, and not to go back to my man George Washington, but we learn about George Washington and how he never tells a lie, and how Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and I think he wrote the Declaration of Independence because my education wasn't that great. And then you have all these things, right? But this is where we learn. This is where we learn that there's, three parts to the government, and, everybody should vote, and it's our duty, and the United States won World War II. And, we learn all of these things. It is a propaganda machine that turns us as the descendants of indigenous people into Americans. We don't live in our history. We live in the settlers' history, right? So what this program was doing, and what the power of Mexican American or Chicano studies is that it teaches us, it takes us out of that history, it takes us out of that timeline, and it places us back in a timeline that makes sense to us. Because now what we're starting to see is who we are, right? Where's our place in all of this? And what we understand from learning that is that this isn't our history, that this isn't our country right now, that we are living in a situation of oppression, right? And that we are involved in a project of resistance. And where does that project of resistance lead to? I mean, this is the question that we have to answer for ourselves right now, is where does this resistance lead, right? Does it lead to more of us voting for Joe Biden? I don't know. I don't think so, right? Does it lead to more of us becoming millionaires? I don't know. I don't necessarily think that that's where it leads to. But I mean, it's a question that we got to slug this out among ourselves, right? This isn't this conversation that we're talking about here, and particularly even this, like when we think about the importance of Mexican American studies, right? That is not a conversation that we have or that we can have meaningfully with people outside of our community. That's a determination that we have to make for ourselves. How important is this, right? I think that's the thing that we have to keep in mind, is that ethnic studies, Chicano studies, Mexican American studies have the potential to pierce, the veil of hegemony, and to pull that curtain back. Then we can see the guy who's operating the machine back there. And I think that's the power, that's the danger of what was going on. And I think that's what was outlawed in Arizona.
Nice, thank you. Next question. What are some of the more pressing issues that you see affecting Latinos and Mexican Americans today? And I would say Mexican Americans more specifically, that are informed by this, this legacy of white settler colonialism? And what are some ways that we can resist and overcome these issues?
Excuse me. Wow, there's so many issues. Of course, the first one that everybody talks about is immigration. Like it jumps to mind. There was a recent within the last 3 or 4 years, by the Pew Hispanic Center, where they were asking people what the top issues facing the Latino community were in the country, and actually immigration came in at number 4. Education, prison, employment, all of those things came in above immigration. And it's not that immigration isn't important. I mean, let's think about this. I mean, I think this is actually a nice segue into this question. I mean, they say there are somewhere around 60 million Latinos in this country right now. Okay. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that that's true, that there are 60 million of us, right? The vast majority of that 60 million people do not have immigration issues at all, right? If that's true, then why are there kids sitting in cages in detention centers right now? Why? How can that be? There are 60 million of us, right? How do we let that happen, right? And you can only blame that, I think, to a certain extent, on disenfranchisement from the political system. Because sure, we've been disenfranchised from the political system, there's no question about it. But there are 60 million of us. That's enough to create our own political system. We don't have to. So this is the thing. As long as 3 out of 4 of us think that we're white, then we also think that they should treat us that way. But you see, I got newsflash. They don't see us as white, right? I mean, we may see ourselves as white, but that's not how they see us. And so the question is how long do we stand around waiting, right, for these people to recognize that we're white, instead of just saying, okay, I don't really think this is working, right? So now what we have to do is think about alternatives. Think about how to create political alternatives to the situations that are happening right now, right? It's clear that we can't do it through the Republican Party. I hate to say it, but I got a lot of, I'm not very confident about the Democratic Party either, So we have a 2-party system that seems to not really worry about us too much. I mean, if there's 60 million of us in this country this year, we are the largest non-white voting bloc in this country. We are absolutely absent from this electoral process. We are not a part of either one of these campaigns. Actually, to tell you the truth, we might be more a part of Trump's campaign than we are Biden's campaign, which is scary. It's weird, right? But I mean, that's kind of where we're at. So this whole notion of settler colonialism, I mean, to understand, right? This is where, to go back to the last question, this is where the power of Mexican American studies comes, because the first thing that we have to understand, and I know I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again, is that this is not our history. This is not our ball game, right? And we can try to play in somebody else's ball game, but we probably would be much better served if we created our own, right? So do Chicanos or Latinos have a political party? I mean, we have the beginnings, we have the semblances, we have the structures for things like that, but it takes time. You have to organize them, right? You have to be willing to work towards that end. This is what I was saying earlier, is that resistance is intentional. It's long term, right? It happens over a period of time. There's no such thing as instantaneous, spontaneous resistance. That's not true, right? It just doesn't happen like that. So when we think about how we can resist, I mean, education is important. One of the things that a group that I'm working with, Mexicanos 2070, that we launched on September 16th a virtual college, Colegio Chicano del Pueblo, and we're offering Chicano studies courses for free to people who want to sign up and take them. We think that that's a good start, or it's a step anyway, something that needs to happen in the community. We need to have talks about politics. We need to build organization, right, in our communities that are going to allow us to mobilize mass amounts of people. I mean, it's not a one-on-one proposition. Great, I have a PhD, great, I get to be a college professor. That literally does nothing to change the economic, political, social reality of my community. It changes my reality, but it doesn't change the reality of the community. And particularly if we don't find a way, right, to take these things that we've acquired, these skills or this knowledge that we've acquired, and reapply it back into the political resistance of our community, then, I mean, again, it doesn't, I mean, we're just playing into this whole idea of settler colonialism, right? Where the individual is paramount, where the individual is the one that stands above. I mean, you see it last night in the debate. I mean, there are two individuals, right, who are just hammering away at each other. I mean, we elected the ultimate individual 4 years ago to be president of this country, and look at what we've reaped as a result of it. So, I mean, this is about group identification. This is about building organization. That is what resistance is about, and it's about understanding that as a group, we have a place. One of the definitions of nation that I really like and that I work with a lot, basically goes like this: that a nation is the largest grouping of people that can command loyalty, which I think is a great definition, because usually when we talk about nation, we talk about nationalism, people talk about how it fractures and it tends to make things smaller. But I don't think that that's true at all. I think it is, in fact, the highest grouping, the largest grouping of people that can command loyalty. And so when we begin to think about it in that way, right, then the whole notion that there are actually 60 million of us takes on a very different tone.
Thank you for that. So those are that was the last of my moderator questions. We're going to switch now to the Q&A session. We have some people that have asked some questions in the chat, and anybody who's wanting to ask a question, you can use your Q&A feature right now and type in a question for Dr. Mireles. So one of the questions that came up is from Sonia Hernandez. She says, the fact that Hispanics and Latinos don't have options other than white in government forums, such as the census, do you think that is why many identify as white, because of the lack of options on forms to identify?
Yes and no. I think that you can. There's every form that I've ever seen always has a other. I mean, you can always write yourself in, whatever you want to be. I mean, this is the thing, right? Is that there is no law. You are under no legal compunction to identify yourself as anything, right? That is information that the government is collecting. You don't have to write either one. You don't have to write anything is my point. So doing it, one, is an intentional act, because you're not under any compulsion to do it. And I think, thinking through what it is that you want to be. The other thing is that I really do think that there are a lot of us who really do think that we're white. I mean, straight up. I mean, there's a whole bunch. I got them in my family, and I know you all listening got them too. Like, they straight up think they're white, and so it's just like, and it's amazing. It's just like that's not going to work out for you the way you think it's going to, and that's not me being a hater. That's just me, after 54 years of life, watching how that plays out for people, and it doesn't usually play out pretty good. I mean, there's one or two, they'll make a lot of money, but I mean, that's also, the economic system that we live in. Not all of us are going to rise to the top. And so I guess, a lot of it depends on, what you're willing to do to achieve that. So that's why I say yes and no, right? I think it's partially that, but I think it's also partially what a lot of people really believe.
What about the Native, just to follow up on this question, my own follow-up question, what about the, there's usually, you can check Native American, right? Mm-hmm. And people oftentimes don't if they're Latino, Mexican American, because as you referred to before, we've lost our tribal affiliation in that history of colonialism, right? So you feel kind of like, well, I'm Native American, but then it's like, sometimes it asks follow-up, okay, what tribe? And you're like, I don't know, right? But yeah. I know I want to identify as Indigenous Native American, right? And so it's also, those forms can be limiting, right? And kind of, right, silencing in a lot of ways. We're okay, then prove it, right? Prove which tribe that you're from, right? Or even, through, scholarships, right? You have to, if you're Indigenous, you have to, right, have a tribal affiliation to be able to get those benefits, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering, because a lot of my students will ask, well, then what do we check, right? If there's only white and, then there's Native American, but then, right, what do we put under that? And so it's like, it's basically kind of subverting the forms, right? Subverting that whole system. It's like, write it in, right? You're going to, identify yourself as you want to be identified, regardless of what the forms are making you write, or check.
I mean, in the 2010 census, 179,492 people who are also identified as Mexican American wrote in that they were Native, that they were Indian, making Mexican Americans the third largest grouping of Indians in the United States in the 2010 census. I mean, there's a lot of things. Like, I hear this on campus with my students all the time too. And I think it's interesting. If you look at anti-colonial writers of the past, I think I'm thinking particularly of Fanon right now. And what Fanon was saying was, when he was talking about Africa at the time, but he was basically saying that colonialism, or the colonizer, they're not worried about what this person is doing or what that group of people are doing. And they don't make that distinction among themselves, right? They don't care about that. That's not what they care about. And so as a result, what Fanon is saying is that the response of the indigenous or the colonized has to be continental in breadth, right? We also have to stop thinking of ourselves as these, and this doesn't mean that people give up their identity, but we have to think about ourselves as bigger than these tribal groupings that we've come into, or that we're being pushed into. Even like as Chicano, right? Like, if we say that Chicano is a tribal grouping, we have to think about ourselves as bigger than that. We have to think of ourselves as indigenous people. There is a system of settler colonialism that has taken over this entire hemisphere, right? This entire side of the globe is ruled by this system of settler colonialism. There is no way for us individually or as individual groups to oppose settler colonialism. It's impossible. If it was possible, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in right now, right? This is one of those let's learn a lesson from the past moments, right? We can only do this if we do it together. And if we start arguing with each other, or denouncing each other as imperialists, right? Because we have ideas about being indigenous, then, I mean, really all we're doing is playing into the hands of settlers.
Thank you. Let's see, we have some good questions here. So as a follow-up to that question about the census, Someone said, I identify as detribalized indigenous, but have been so colonized that I feel guilty for doing that. So some people feel guilty for identifying as indigenous when, right? When we've been, you know, like you said, so socialized, right? Into the settler colonialist culture, right? So here's a good question here from John Anderson. So he says, why does group identity have to clash with other races, with government? Should I be held responsible for the animosity given to Anglo-Saxon settlers' actions? I was under the impression that both natives, Hispanic, and whites fought for Texas independence and then joined the Union. Whites were not the majority in those actions. Our ancestors chose that. Is it important? So is it important to throw that away? So that's complicating things a little.
I mean, maybe you could help me out with that question a little bit. You think you could give me some like an interpretation of that question?
I think what he's speaking from is from the perspective of being white, right, today, and then looking at the history specifically within Texas, right, for Texas independence, right? So how in that time frame, right, you had a minority of Anglo, right, settlers in Texas, right, who fought for Texas independence, right? And you had the Mexicans, right?
Sure.
You had some of the Tejanos that were fighting, right, for Texas independence.
Absolutely.
So I think his question is, can there be another perspective, I guess from his perspective? He said whites were not the majority in those actions, right? He says that the Anglo settlers, right, they chose those actions to fight for that independence. So he asks, is it important to throw that away? So I guess like looking at that example, right?
So I don't think that we need to throw anything away. I also don't think that it changes my answer in any way. I mean, the time period that you're talking about still falls within the time period of settler colonialism, right? I mean, my point, and I think the point of this book is that there's this system that's called settler colonialism. All right, we see that, we understand it, we're a part of it, we can't remove ourselves from it. Like there's no way for us to extract ourselves from this system. The only way that we can extract ourselves from this system is by engaging in this process of national liberation that creates a disruption to settler colonialism, that overthrows it, that replaces it, right? And that institutes what Benjamin and other philosophers would call a new law, right? That's the only way to do this. So it isn't even necessarily like a criticism of other people, right? And honestly, it's not a criticism of white people. To be real honest with you, it's a criticism of settler colonialism, right? It's a criticism of that system, which, you know, again, I mean, if 3 out of 4 Latinos in the United States think that they're white or they identify as white, they're part of that settler colonial system. They're upholding that settler colonial system. So this isn't an attack in any way, shape, or form on anybody. What it is, right, is an exhortation to other people, to that 25%, to say, hey, what are you guys thinking about right now, right? Because I mean, I'm gonna be real honest with you. I didn't write this book for white people. I wrote this book for other Mexicans, right? This is a conversation that I'm trying to have inside my own community, and it's really not about attacking other people. I mean, you know, yeah, it's just not. I think that's a waste of time, you know. So I mean, what happened in Texas, I think is interesting, right? Do you need to throw it out? I'm not really sure. I'm still not really sure exactly what that means. I don't think that we need to throw anything out. But I think that we need to understand that it's regardless of how it happened, regardless if it was all Mexicans that did it, all Tejanos, right? That it still falls within the scope of, you know, this period of settler colonial history. That's what I think.
Thank you. So let's see how much more time. We have about 5 minutes, maybe 2 more questions. Let's see. So you have, let's see. So there's a question here. There is a generation of Mexican Americans whose parents denied them their culture and language in order to assimilate into the dominant American culture. The impact is obviously devastating and traumatic. How can they work? How can the children, right, who were affected by this, this assimilation, how can they work to regain their indigeneity, their indigenous identity? What do you think?
Well, I think that I think that there are a lot of good books that have been written. I think that there are political organizations locally in communities all over the country that are good to get involved in. I grew up uh, with a white mother and a black stepfather. I did not grow up with the Mexican side of my family, and so a lot of what um, I've learned, right, I had to teach myself. And I think that that's, also a condition of where we are in this timeline. So there's no shame in picking up a history book about Mexico, about the conquest, or reading about the Chicano movement. These are not things that just because your parents were Mexican. That's not how it works. That's not how genetics works, right? That's what they want us to think. That's also a part of this system, right? In thinking that we are authentically, that there are things that we know because of who we are. But culture is not passed on through genetics. Culture is passed on through material condition and through the experiences that we have in the world. And so if you don't have those experiences, right, then there's no way that you can know that. Resistance is intentional, right? Learning your history is intentional. It is resistance. Learning culture, parts of your culture, right? That is intentional. That is resistance. I never cumbia'd until I was in college, right? Never did. Never had the chance. Never had the opportunity, right? Love cumbias. Never even heard one until I was in college, right? This is the thing that we have to keep in mind, right? Is that we cannot allow any sort of sense of failing on our part, right? We're not failing as Chicanos. We're not failing as Mexicanos. That's not the thing, right? Because there isn't necessarily a way to fail at that, right? There's really only a way to succeed at it. Because you don't know, that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. I mean, but we hear this all the time, right? People are like, oh, I feel guilty because I don't speak Spanish as good as I should, right? Or I don't do this, or I don't do that. I mean, these things that is the colonizer's voice inside your head telling you, just let it go, right? Just let it go. It's really not that big of a deal. You know, you don't need to resist. Everything is going to be fine, you know. And so when they first come, they do that through the military, right? But after they've been here for a couple centuries, they don't need to do it that way anymore because we do it to ourselves, right? Is it we're the ones that are keeping ourselves in check right now, right? There are 60 million of us. It's time to get those kids out of those cages. I mean, for real. Joe Biden, there isn't a Mexican in this country that should vote for Joe Biden until those kids, or for any of them, there shouldn't even be an election. Everything should stop until those kids come out of that cage. Then we can move forward, right? But we're worried about all of these other things while these children languish. I mean, I have 4 children. I have 7 grandchildren. When I think about it, it makes me sick to my stomach. But, here we are. So I think, yeah, we just got to keep moving forward. And remember that every book you read, every history book you read, every action you participate in, every organization that you join, those are intentional acts. That is resistance. That is how you learn what it means to be Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx.
Thank you. So that was the last question. We're out of time for the talk, but I think that's a good segue and a plug for Mexican American Studies. I would say that because I teach Mexican American Studies. I'm an advocate of Mexican American Studies for everyone. There was one question I'll just mention that they asked, do you think other races other than Mexican Americans can benefit from Mexican American Chicano Studies? I say yes. I have many students who are not Mexican American and they become super involved. They become activists, and it's amazing to see that, right?
Yes.
Because we need allies, right? Everybody should be working towards social justice, right? For everybody. And so as we end, can you tell us again, someone had asked in the chat if you can state again what the free Chicano Studies college is, how people can get involved with that, and then also your podcast and how they can keep in touch with what you're doing?
So I do a weekly podcast with a bunch of other people. It's called The Reality Dysfunction. It's hosted on Podbean. That's The Reality Dysfunction. We also have a Facebook page called The Reality Dysfunction. The school that we started, and I'll just let you all know, we launched this on September 16th. And as of this morning, right before I got on this call, I checked, and there were 461 people that had signed up for this school from all over the country. It's called Colegio Chicano del Pueblo. And you can also find that on the Mexicanos 2070 page on Facebook, or mexicanos2070.com, which is our website. And so
Mexicanos, can you spell Mexicanos for
oh
everybody?
yeah, it's Mexicanos, but with the X, MEXICANOS 2070.com. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
Just to be clear, yeah, because
Yeah.
make sure people typed it in correctly if they're looking for it.
So we're accepting all applications. It's free. We have 3 classes right now. We had a faculty meeting yesterday with about 20 people who are all committing to create courses. Eventually, and not that far in the future, we're working out a credit deal with Prescott College, where I teach at, where students who complete 32 credits through the Colegio will be eligible to receive up to 32 credits through Prescott College. And so we're working that deal out right now. I think it's going to be a really great deal. We're super excited about it. And, I think in so many ways, this really represents a giant step forward for Chicano studies.
Definitely. And just as a plug for our Mexican American Studies program, we also offer Mexican American Studies courses at Palo Alto College that you can enroll in. And, I teach Intro to Mexican American Studies and Mexican American Fine Arts Appreciation. So anybody listening want to enroll?
Sounds
We're always
good.
looking for people to enroll.
Yeah.
So thank you so much again for being with us. It was such a really, really engaging conversation. Really great questions that came out of it. So best of luck. Hopefully people pick up your book. Oh, and also we're going to be doing a raffle for the book that you donated. So
Right.
At least one lucky person will get your book and and be able to read it.
I hope they enjoy it. All right.
Yeah. So thank you, and we'll keep up with what you're doing. I think what you're doing is very important, and thank you for all the work that you're doing.
I really appreciate this opportunity to come and talk to you guys. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. So
All
best
right.
of luck.
All right.
Thanks.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Let's see. Okay, everybody, if you're able to, can you please complete the survey that is located in the chat feature at this time? We will have 5 to 10 minutes so that you can complete it. If you can do that as efficiently as you can, we'll go ahead and let you all do that. And that will enroll you. That will be part of your attendance. And then also we're gonna have a raffle, including the book that Dr. Mireles has donated.